Welcome back for day 3 of the Seeding Liberation series. Now, if you've missed what this is all about, I am sharing daily transmissions every day this week for 5 days, leading up to my RootWork for Liberation program. And that program is all about exploring the soil we were planted in order to tend to the roots of our being. And our roots are really representative of our unconscious beliefs and patterns of behavior that we have inherited, that we have absorbed, that we have taken on. And in this series, I am sharing with you the different ways that we form or create our unconscious beliefs, how they come to be. And so we have been going through different types. On Monday, we talked about the shadow of repression or the shadow of rejection. Yesterday, we talked about the shadow of retention, how we hold on to the unresolved trauma of our ancestors. And today we are talking about the shadow of protection. And the shadow of protection is really representative of our coping strategies, our survival strategies. These are things that we took on at some point in our lives in order to keep us safe. But at some point, they become prisons that keep us small. And our protective shadows oftentimes can play out through self-fulfilling prophecies. This is how they become prisons of our own making. So there is something that we are protecting ourselves from that eventually becomes the source of our pain. The ways in which we protect ourselves eventually morph into patterns of pain, patterns that lead to pain. And again, they are intended initially to keep us safe. So at one point in time, they served a purpose. They were functional patterns. But over time, they become morphed and distorted, and they become dysfunctional and self-fulfilling prophecies. So I'm going to share, again, a couple of examples with you. The first is one of my own, a self-fulfilling prophecy. This very much ties into what I shared yesterday around this feeling of being unwanted, this feeling of being rejected, being undesirable. And so, again, this is part of my subconscious wiring, and it is very present with me as I move through life. The fear of being unwanted. Now, what happens as a result of this fear, of this insecurity, is that I will create the conditions or the circumstances. I will unconsciously create these conditions or circumstances that offer me feedback or evidence that the fear I have is true. And then it creates a loop. It creates a pattern, right? So for me, because I have this fear of being unwanted or of being rejected, I will let that fear infiltrate my way of thinking as I am relating to people, as I am being social, engaging with new folks. So I've shared about this on the podcast before, but what often happens for me when I meet new people is that if there is any indication, if I somehow can't read them or I'm unsure of how they feel about me, I will default to my fear, which is that they don't like me, right? I am unwanted. I have been rejected. And once that fear kind of crystallizes in my mind, then I will shift, I will alter my behavior. So I'll be a little bit more awkward, I'll be a little bit more distant, I'll be more withdrawn. For example, I will assume that people don't want to invite me to a social event. I will assume that I'm not wanted there. So I will avoid, I will avoid any chance for invitation. And if someone does invite me, my story becomes they did it because they felt sorry for me, because there was pity. And so I won't go. And then that leads to eventually people stop inviting me places because their assumption based on my behavior is that I don't want to be there. Whereas my behavior is rooted in my assumption that I'm not wanted there. And it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where I avoid people in order to avoid being rejected. But eventually people start avoiding me because my behavior gives them the impression that I am the one who has rejected them. But all of this is rooted in my fear of rejection and is part of my pattern of protection, self-protection, right? I had a client who very much from her adolescence, there was a lot of pressure and expectation on her to be perfect in every way. And what she most deeply desires is for depth and intimacy and vulnerability with people in her relationships. But perfectionism is part of her protective pattern. And part of how that manifests is that she actually cuts herself off from being vulnerable with people, from being intimate with people, because that feels like imperfection. And she is supposed to be perfect. So she will not express her vulnerabilities, her fears, her insecurities, even though that is what will actually lead to the kind of connection she is craving. But because she will be, her perception is that she will be imperfect if she does that. And her protective patterns are rooted in perfection. So she rejects the vulnerability and the intimacy and the depth that she actually really, 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 really wants. Right? And so it is this self-fulfilling prophecy where she is actually cut off from the connection that she desires because she is focused on performing her protective pattern of perfection. Again, it is the perception that doing this keeps me safe. But the reality is doing this keeps me trapped. Keeps me trapped in all the things that make me and my life feel small. Right? And so again, it's like, how do we work with this? The awareness is the first part. We have to become aware that we are in these patterns, that we are perpetuating these loops, and we are creating this confinement for ourselves. And we have to give the parts of us that needed the pattern for survival. We have to give those parts of ourselves grace, compassion, support. And we have to understand, what is it that we really need underneath this, right? Because what we're doing through the protective pattern is we are avoiding pain, we are avoiding discomfort, we are avoiding shame. And that's why I've set up my program as I have, RootWork for Liberation. It is designed to be a space where you can open up, let your walls down, be held in your pain, let go of your shame. It is designed in such a way to cultivate the safety and the support for that to happen so that we can meet the parts of ourselves that don't want to be seen. right? The parts of ourselves that are operating in these mechanisms of protection. So we can meet them and understand again, what is the unmet need beneath the pattern? And how do I start to meet that need? How do I shift the way I show up in my life, in my lived experience, so that that need can be met and I am not just looping around and around again and again in this dissatisfaction, in this pain, in this survival mechanism, so that we can move out of survival into actually thriving in our lives. So again, you are invited to join us for RootWork for Liberation. The link to join the waitlist is in the show notes. If you want a taste of the program experience, join us this Sunday, November 23rd, for a preview of the program. Bring with you one challenge that you're facing, one pattern you want to break, one cycle you want to disrupt. Bring it with you, and we will get to the root of it on Sunday together. All right, tune in tomorrow where we're going to talk about the shadow of introjection.